Very warm welcome to you all. Delightful to see so many here. My name is Jeremy Begbie. I teach here at the Divinity School, and I direct Duke initiatives in theology and the arts. It's my pleasure and great honor to welcome Dr. Iain McGilchrist to the school. For many here, he will need little introduction, which is just as well, since trying to enumerate all his qualifications and roles would take far longer than we have. But at the very least, he is a psychiatrist, a researcher in neuroscience, a philosopher, a literary scholar, and I would add, cultural interpreter. His most widely influential work, and best known, is the Master and His Emissary, a remarkable study which many here will have read. How many people have read that here as a matter of interest? Yes, good. This has sold over 100,000 copies, and the reception of this book has surprised even the author himself. It's had a profound effect on my own work. If I said I found it hard to put down, that wouldn't be quite right, since it stopped me in my tracks so many times, I often had to do just that. It's been lauded in scores of reviews, not least by those in neurological science, but most distinguished of all, the actor and comedian John Cleese of Monty Python fame. I love this book above all others because it promises to help me understand paradoxes that have puzzled me all my life. And just to prove the association, there they are. More about humor later on. More recently, the gargantuan two-volume The Matter with Things appeared and is already garnering plaudits from a huge range of readers, including no less a figure than Rowan Williams. In this session, we're going to have a conversation around various topics, but especially the arts and how they open onto the world of the sacred and theology. And I'm going to leave room for a few questions at the end. So would you then please join me in welcoming Iain McGilchrist to Duke Divinity School? Thank you. Iain, do sit there. That's fine.
Very good.
Thank you so much for giving up your time in this way. We realize time is very short. This man gets about, I think it's 10 invitations per week, so we're extremely grateful that you've given time to us here. I think it's fair to say that you're best known for your work on hemisphere lateralization, left brain, right brain, and you're very keen to distinguish it from popular views, that particular duality. Talk about that for a bit, if you would, and give us, if you can manage, a kind of brief overview of where you stand on that.
The elevator pitch, yes, I'll do my best. The first hurdle I have to get over is that people have heard that everything to do with hemispheres is pop psychology, and it's all nonsense and was debunked about 40 years ago, or 30 at any rate. And I need to get you to put out of your mind anything that you know about hemisphere differences, unless you've read it in my books. Partly because I'm certainly the chief exponent of a new way of thinking about hemisphere differences. The idea that the right hemisphere was somehow airy-fairy and creative, while the left hemisphere was unemotional, responsible, and a little bit dull, is not true at all. The left hemisphere is much less reliable than the right. Emotions in both hemispheres, and the one that most clearly lateralizes is anger, and it lateralizes to the left hemisphere. So none of that is true. So what is the difference? Well, it boils down to something that doesn't, at the first hearing it, sound terrifically exciting. It's to do with attention. And attention is very important because how we attend to something changes what we see there, and it changes us who are doing the attending. We become different people if we attend to the world in one way from another. What are those two phenomenological worlds like? In brief, we have evolved these two differences to do different things. All the neural networks we know going right back 700 million years have an asymmetry in them. This seems rather odd. Why would they have an asymmetry? And why would there be, in most animals we look at, two distinct neural bases that only tangentially communicate with one another. They need to communicate, of course, but the corpus callosum, the band of fibers at the base of the brain, is a mammalian invention. Until there were mammals, there were just two rather separate brains. And this is to solve the problem of how you get stuff and manipulate stuff and also remain alive. Because to do the getting, the grabbing, the manipulating, you need to have very fine attention to detail so that you can quickly grab it, precisely get it, and be one ahead of the next creature that might have taken your seed or your twig or your rabbit or whatever it is. So that's the left hemisphere's role. It is to manipulate the world. And the right hemisphere's role is to look out for everything else while the left hemisphere is busy grabbing and getting. And that means that it has precisely opposite attention. Instead of a piecemeal, highly detailed, intensely focused attention on something like 3 degrees of the attentional arc, the right hemisphere has sustained, open, vigilant attention to whatever there is without any kind of preconception. And so this gives rise to these two different kinds of world. In the left hemisphere's world, there are things that we know we want. That they are things we've deliberately targeted because they're of value to us to give us power, energy, use. And that attention generates a world made up of bits, of fragments that are isolated from one another, decontextualized, meaningless, except in terms of the utility they have for us. It's, in other words, a very strange, abstract kind of world. Things are taken out of their context. The unique becomes just an example of something general. And we have a world of categories, boxes, but a simply unembodied, disembodied kind of world. Whereas in the right hemisphere, there are no things that are finally certain. Everything is provisional. We have degrees of certainty about them. They're never actually static as they are in the left hemisphere. They're always moving, they're always flowing, they're always changing, and they're completely incapable of being viewed separately. They are bound up into a web of relationships which make them what they are. Everything is ultimately interconnected with everything else as far as the right hemisphere is concerned. And it is able to understand all the stuff that is implicit. The left hemisphere understands explicit messages, but it doesn't understand implicitness. So it doesn't understand jokes. It takes them seriously and is completely puzzled by them. It doesn't understand irony, humor, empathy, all the things that make life rich for us. It doesn't understand that some things, indeed all the really good things, need to remain implicit, that when they're made explicit, they change their nature. Things like love, sex, religion, art, poetry, music, drama, theory, rituals, not the theories, but the shapes of things. And instead, the left hemisphere is interested in the theory, in the background, in the map, the overall diagram of things. And it's a world like a map. The distinction is really between a world in which things are present to us, or even better, presence to us, as Heidegger would have said. In other words, they have an active presence for us. We make them what they exactly are by our attention. We don't make them up, but we do partake in what they are. But for the left hemisphere, everything is cold, detached, remote, inanimate, and somewhat like the world of a map as compared to the far, far richer, more complex world that is mapped, which is the right hemisphere's world. So that's it in a nutshell.
Fantastic. Be absolutely clear, you're sometimes accused of... That's right.
Oh.
That's going to be better. I'm sorry.
Let's switch the other one off. Yeah.
It'll be all right. They can do that as well. You're sometimes accused of setting good right brain against bad left brain. That's clearly what you're not doing, right? Yeah. You're quite fond of the left brain.
I'm very fond of it. It's
yes.
My second favorite hemisphere.
It's your second favorite hemisphere. Absolutely. Good. You're sometimes also accused wrongly of being anti-science. You're not anti-science.
Absolutely not. I find myself having to defend science. An awful lot of science has gone into my work and is my life. So I do defend science. I just say that science can't answer all our questions. It doesn't set out to do. No reputable scientist who understands what they're doing in science would claim that it can answer a certain whole range of questions that are probably the most important ones for living human beings.
You sometimes liken a cultural situation to a kind of mental illness. Could you say more on that?
Well, there are certain abnormal functionings in psychiatry that are somewhat like the way we think now. The most obvious is people who have an injury to the right hemisphere, and they cease to be able to understand the world. They can't put together what people really mean, which is often not just in the words as they would be accepted by a computer, but involves understanding how humans express themselves and think, and what is not being said. And this is also true of people with certain mental illnesses, such as schizophrenia, which mimics a hypofunction, in other words, a loss of function in the right hemisphere, compensated by overdrive in the left hemisphere. And to some extent, some people with autism represent something of the same kind. They tend to misunderstand emotional and social matters, but they can be very good at a sort of following of rules and procedures, and become sometimes unhappy if things can't be schematized in that way.
Here we are in a major university. What are some of the consequences for higher education?
The consequences for
higher education,
yes.
Do you think, today? Both analyzing it, both getting a view of what's going on and what could be. Just a few that might come to mind.
A few. Well, I think that the emphasis on so-called STEM subjects is exaggerated. In other words, there's nothing wrong with them, they're important, but they're actually not an education in themselves. They teach techniques, they teach you how to manipulate data in certain ways, but they don't really help you understand what a human being is, what a human life is, what the cosmos is, and how we relate to it. These are things that come out of the humanities, and the key is in the name. They help us understand human beings. And to do that, you need to know something about history, you need to study literature, you need to be acquainted with music and philosophy. These are different. These are things that actually help draw out from you latent knowledge that needs encouraging to flourish. And if it's never drawn out by a proper education rooted in the humanities, you are taken by surprise all the time by life. Some doctors I know are really genuinely puzzled and almost hurt if you suggest to them that the human body is not a machine.
That's on to the next area I'd love to explore. You have quite an aversion to mechanistic metaphors. The machine metaphor is applied to the cosmos at large, and also to the human person, especially to the brain, the notion of the brain as a computer. That kind of language and that metaphorical system, let's call it, is pretty widespread today. Why is it so misleading? Might it not have limited usefulness? Particularly, say we start with the person and the brain at the moment.
Talk about the brain?
Yes. Initially, and then we can go on.
Well, we're encouraged to think of the brain as a kind of computer of some sort, but of course it isn't. And to explain the whole story of why organisms are nothing like machines, I'd have to almost repeat last night's talk, which was on that topic. If you want to read more about that, again, it's in The Matter with Things. But
just highlight one or two of those things. In what way are we not machines?
Well, for example, you can switch a machine off and come back 5 years later and switch it on, and on the whole, expect it to work. But you can't do that with a person. Organisms have complex systems, which are different from complicated systems. A computer is a complicated system. A jet engine is a complicated system. But life is complex, which means it has reentrant loops, it has manifold connections, even a single cascade of just 5 stages in biochemistry can have 720 outcomes, and there are interactions between all of the parts of those cascades. I give a diagram of that in my book. But think about this. In a cell, there are literally millions of interactive chains of things going on every second. You cannot model this so that you have a clear idea of the outcome. A cell has intelligence. A single cell has intelligence. In other words, it can solve a problem that it's not prepared for by its hereditary, by evolutionary history, nor by previous experience. But it can be, you can insult it, as we say, you can cause harm to it artificially in a way that the cell is not prepared how to react to. And it will nonetheless cohere its response right across the organism and produce an intelligent and original response. And it doesn't have to wait for billions of years for randomness to come up with the answer. It happens within the next 24 hours. So this is very extraordinary. So those are some of the things. The parts and the whole, the parts of a machine we understand because we made them, but the so-called parts of the body are not really parts at all. This is an artificial way of looking at them. They are wholes at a different level. There is no clear boundary between an organism and its environment, and the environment and the organism create one another. But a machine, this is not true. A machine has defined boundaries, and it is not involved in an interdependent co-arising of something. And above all, no machine can start from roughly nowhere and generate the instructions for its own further development. A machine has to have the instructions first and then can carry out procedures. But the whole business of life is infinitely creative from the word go. There's a lot more I could say and a lot more I have said, but I want to make it clear that we are nothing like machines.
Thank you. How have we got to that way of looking at things?
How?
How have we got to that way of looking at things? Why has this become such a dominant way of viewing the world? The mechanistic model in particular. The
mechanistic model. Well, it rose to the fore in the scientific revolution at the end of the 17th century and was consolidated by the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And these are projections of effectively the way that the left hemisphere works. And the left hemisphere's aim is always control, power, utility. But as was pointed out by Lessing in the 18th century, those who believe in utility have to answer the further question, utility for what? If the answer is just more utility, it doesn't make any sense. So the utilitarian has to have other values, such as possibly goodness, beauty, and truth, I would like to suggest, that might validate the reason for having power at all. It can't just be for utility. But we now live in a world which is very much dominated by this incredibly simple-minded desire for more stuff. I mean, it's everywhere. I don't really need to explain it to you. It's all around us, and it's embedded in the fabric of modern Western society. So what I think we got into was we had some heady moments when we learned how to control things, and this made us feel that we were the masters of creation. But this hubris has led us to destroy our own creation. In other words, our civilization is falling apart for want of higher values, which we once entertained, but have been driven out by the overwhelming desire for control.
And the left brain wants to get stuff.
Wants to get stuff and manipulate stuff and make things that will be useful to it. And of course, what's wonderful is that physics, 100 years ago, discovered that this model of the universe as a machine is very far from the truth. Physics shows that the universe is nothing remotely like a machine. And we're in the peculiar situation that those who are the scientists of the inanimate world believe that consciousness plays a central part, and those who are the scientists of the animate world pretend that consciousness doesn't exist. However, I'd just like to add a note of optimism. Just in the last few years, some biologists are beginning to rediscover that organisms are not like machines at all. And I particularly mention here Mike Levin at Tufts, who has some fascinating work on this very area. He's a developmental biologist, but he shows that we have to think of wholes, we have to think of top-down causation, we have to think of patterns that are preserved somewhere, we don't know where, that guide the growth of an organism.
All this suggests that awe and wonder need to be, in some sense, recovered or have gone missing. Am I right? And that will lead us on to the arts. But do you want to say anything about about wonder and awe, not least in the sciences, perhaps?
Well, properly seen, the sciences are a constant source of wonder and awe, and it was that as a child led me to think that I wanted to be a scientist at all. But when I actually came to study science at school, I found that it was obsessed with technical information and ignored all the philosophical complications. And so I wanted to read more in philosophy and the humanities, and so that's what I did. Yeah. So wonder and awe are not the products of ignorance, they're the products of insight, to which our awareness is clouded by a veil of familiarity and the belief that we understand everything. We don't understand very much at all, and when it comes to organisms, very little indeed.
What's that thing about knowing less and actually knowing more? Or
yes.
Is that...
Well, there's something in psychology known as the Dunning-Krueger effect, which is basically that the less you know, the more you think you know. And people who know almost nothing think they know everything. Whereas if you know a lot, you realize how very little you know.
You're trained in English literature. Indeed, at lunch, you managed to quote a great deal of Canterbury Tales from memory. You have a regular poetry reading on your website. You have a chapter in the Master and His Emissary on music and language, and you have many references to the visual arts. To what extent, in light of what you've just been saying, what extent do you think the arts can help us recover, no, let's put it another way, resist some of the cultural developments you've just been speaking about?
Well, anyone who really comes to understand even a piece of music and love it knows that this cannot be reduced to procedures or to verbal information or really to any kind of information that's helpful. What, after all, is music composed of? Let's be analytic for a moment. It's made up of notes. What is a note? A single tone. And what does that mean? Nothing at all. Put another note alongside. What does that mean? Nothing at all. Put 30,000 of them together and you've got a piece of Bach or Beethoven that can change your life. So something magical is happening in the spaces. It's all in the relations, the relationships and the spaces that go between notes and make the melody, the relationships between lines that make the harmony, and the relations between the ictus in the movement which creates the rhythm. So it is all something and nothing, something very great, but something that can't be grasped in this way. But you don't even need to think like that. Just think about love. If you've ever experienced love, do you think it's real? Or do you think it's just nothing? It's very real, isn't it? It's one of the realest things you can experience. But can you reproduce it in the lab? Can you measure it? Can you manipulate it? Not at all. So you can certainly find markers which you think represent love, but they're nothing really like love at all.
Some music. Please. That we heard earlier. Is this going to come through? Right. It was going to be Tallis, Thomas Tallis. Let's just think about that very piece for a second. Why has that kind of music, this is 16th century polyphony, why has that become so important to you?
Well, it became important to me because it was the greatest discovery of my early teens. I arrived at a new school age 12, and I was suddenly aware of music around me in the chapel and in little choir groups that was staggeringly beautiful. And it wasn't just beautiful, it seemed to me spiritual. It couldn't be reduced to just emotion or intellect, although it had some of both of those about it. But the overwhelming impact was of something that spoke to one's spirit or soul. And I'm talking here about the great composers of the 16th century and early 17th century, people like Palestrina, Victoria, Tallis, Bird. If you know these people, you know what I mean. This is an astonishingly rich thing that I was suddenly introduced to. And I was also introduced to religious poetry about the same time. And it was actually through these things that religion revealed its truth to me. I felt there was something divine, something sacred here. It can't be dismissed as anything else. Yeah. And that led me into the idea of Christianity and its stories, the beauty of the Bible, of rituals, of ceremonies, and so forth. I still don't know if I'm a Christian or a good Christian or a bad Christian, but I'm certainly not a Christian, and the mythos of it speaks to me very profoundly.
Definitely, we'll come back to that. You have a fascinating chapter on language and music. You follow many writers in saying that what we now call language, what we call music, have a common source in something that's actually much more like music than
yes.
what we would now call language. And that this was related to social cohesion, that is, the bonding of people together in profound ways. Do you know the writer Hartmut Rosa wrote a book on
Yes,
resonance?
I do, yes.
A quote from, it could have been you. The peculiar quality of music lies not in its ability to refer to or designate objects beyond itself, but in its ability to produce a highly specific form of relating to the world. Music negotiates the quality of relation itself, whereas language and science systems can only ever thematize one particular relationship to or segment of the world at a time. Music is the rhythm, sound, melodies, and tones between self and world.
Wonderful. Yes.
There's a great deal in what he's saying, I think, in that book, and indeed on the metaphor of resonance that does, dare I say it, resonate with your own work.
Yes. Well, resonance is an important image, isn't it?
Of course.
And I believe that, in fact, everything is composed of resonant relationships, i.e. two-way relationships, in which one thing evokes something from the other, and the other in turn evokes something from the one, except that it's not turn by turn. It's happening all the time interdependently.
Yeah. Could I push you just one stage further on the musical thing? That you speak quite a bit about what happens with music between people, between human beings, those relations. But of course, there's an ancient and venerable tradition that wants to say music is tapping into cosmic order at large, the whole Pythagorean tradition taken right
yes. into
the Christian church up until about 1500 and 1600, when it begins to wane. And it strikes me, you don't say a great deal about that in your, as far as I can tell, but you do speak about the universe as, for want of a better, coherent and surprising. And it strikes me that a characteristic of nearly all music is precisely that as well. Do you want to reflect a bit on music's wider significance, and we might have lost that?
Goodness, yes. Well, it's just worth mentioning that because we didn't go there explicitly, that I believe that language evolved out of music, and there still are people such as the Peter Han in the Amazon basin who communicate mainly by music and communicate quite specific things through that music. So I don't believe with Steven Pinker that it's an acceptation of, music is an acceptation of language about as useful, as he says, as pornography or cheesecake. Yeah. It is something deep and very profound. I think it's partly because it is relational in its nature, and it is therefore the best example we have of pure relationality. Yeah. Another can be architecture, and there are buildings I have been into in my life that have changed my way of feeling about things simply by being in their presence. One is Vierzehnheiligen in Bavaria, which I'd seen pictures of, but nothing actually substituted of being in the space. And another is Santo Spirito in Florence, one of Brunelleschi's churches, which again looks rather dull in a photograph. But when you feel the embodied space around you, something unmistakable is happening, which is relational. It's relational between the parts, and it relates to you. Now, music is just like this, and I think Goethe said that architecture is frozen music. Yes. So I think that's the deep meaning, but of course it also has other kinds of meaning. It speaks to us at all levels. It speaks directly to our emotions so that it can move us to tears. And this is extraordinary because it's just noises, really. but very, very special ones that have a particular meaning. I wouldn't know whether to try and suggest that music has meaning in itself apart from humanity. That's a speculation too far.
Okay, all right, fair enough. Well, just one other art form, though. Do speak to us about this painting, which I know means a great deal to you.
Well,
Where is this? It's Istanbul, I think.
It is in Istanbul. It's in a church called St. Saviour in Hora. Its Muslim name is the Carrier Jami, the Friday Mosque, because it is a church that has been turned into a mosque, but it has now been turned into a museum, so it's, there it is. And this, I was not prepared for this. I was 17 or 18, and I went for 4 or 5 months to walk around the Middle East, and I spent some time in what used to be Constantinople, Istanbul, and I loved particularly many of the mosques, but this particular church. And I walked in, and there's this extraordinary, I think it's 12th century mosaic of Christ and his mother. And I'd never seen anything quite so moving in the visual arts before. It seemed to express so much. The gravity of the face of Christ, knowing his role and his fate, and his mother also perceiving that, and the tenderness that is in her attitude, and the sort of the sheer awe-inspiring nature of the look of the face of Christ. And it's these things that really, in the end, speak to you about a mythos that is great. I use the word mythos not in the sense of a modern myth. I'm not saying there isn't truth in Christianity. I believe there is, but it is still a very powerful mythos.
That leads beautifully on to perhaps the last section, which talk a little about that dimension. A lot of writers have noticed strong resonances, again, between your work and basic Christian convictions. You've had dialogues with N.T. Wright, with Rowan Williams, who's a great fan of your work, although he distances himself slightly from your brand of theology, I think, but as you've said. You devote a whole chapter to the matter of things, to the sacred, which some people said you shouldn't have done. Is that right?
Yes,
Or were resisting it? So
yes.
Why did you persist with that?
Well, because it would be like building an arch and then not putting the keystone in. I was very, very keen to do something that's difficult, which is to take people with a very modern mentality and take them by steps that they will assent to a place where they can see something they've been blotting out of their minds because they already know it must be nonsense. So I wanted to recast the whole business of faith as about an understanding of something, a disposition of the soul, rather than a matter of signing up to 8 impossible things before breakfast. And I hope to be able to lead them by steps they would understand through science, through philosophy, to a place where we now look at what the constituents of the cosmos are. And I talk about the coincidence of opposites, about the one and the many, about flow and movement, which I realize is as foundational for being as anything else. That came as a surprise to me. And then I talk about space and matter and consciousness. And it surprises some people. I then go on to talk about values and purpose. But these are very important in life, and they have been recognized in science for a very long time. The old idea of a telos that Aristotle proposed, the idea of a direction in which things tend and to which they are drawn, is becoming impossible to ignore in biology. And I think it was J.B.S. Haldane said that purpose is the mistress with which every scientist cannot live without but doesn't want to be seen with in public. And this idea is a good one. When you talk to scientists privately, they say, well, of course there's direction and purpose in these processes, but I mustn't say that. So then science dares to say, well, there is no purpose, but that's because it ruled purpose out from the start, purpose and value, in fact. And then I come to the sense of the sacred. And that chapter is about 113 pages long. It's the length of a short book, and it cost me more than anything I've ever written to get it right, or at least as right as I could. And what I wanted very much to do was not to exclude anybody, partly because I myself have drawn a great deal from other traditions than the Christian, from the Vedanta, from Buddhism, from Zen, from Taoism, and so forth. So all these things are rich and important. And I wanted to show important commonalities that suggested they could never be understood by the left hemisphere, but could be understood by the right hemisphere. Earlier in the book, I devoted 400 pages, the opening pages, to showing that the right hemisphere is more veridical than the left. If you have to follow the take of either of them, you're much better advised to follow that of the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere on its own is frankly delusional. That's just not my opinion, but that of a number of neurologists have made the same point. And it's very obvious, if you're a psychiatrist, that delusional syndromes are usually due to damage to the right hemisphere, almost always. Very rarely anything to do with damage to the left. So overall, I needed to put that in there, and I hadn't put it into the Master and His Emissary because there's a saying that Queen Victoria didn't mind what people do as long as they didn't do it in the street and frighten the horses. And so I didn't want to frighten the horses by putting in anything overtly religious. But the Master and His Emissary is, in a way, crypto-theological. Now, the interesting thing is that my philosophical friend said, don't put in this chapter because there's a lot of interesting philosophy in this book, but nobody will take you seriously if you put in a chapter on the sacred. And I thought, well, I'm going to take a risk on it because as far as I'm concerned, it's the most important thing that I have to help people to see again. And to my amusement, I've had no flack from atheists. Guess who I've had all the flack from? Christians. Christians write to me and say, there's a Christ-shaped hole in this chapter. Why have you not filled it? And I say to myself, well, if you can see that hole, you've got the message. I didn't need to spell it out, did I? And I think by spelling it out, I might have put off a lot of people. But those who have eyes to see and those who have ears to hear will be able to see what they need to see and what they need to hear when they read what I've written.
Yeah. When you were at high school, as they would say here, you actually wanted to do theology originally, right? And
yes.
You considered being a monk.
Yes, rather oddly.
Very sad loss for the monastic world.
I'm not sure about that. I think I saved a monastery a great deal of trouble. But oddly enough, coming from an absolutely non-religious background, neither of my parents were religious and they didn't take me to church. In my teens, I suddenly discovered this whole incredibly rich world, which responded to many intuitions I had about the nature of things. Interestingly, you know, Dawkins says that children would never have these ideas if they weren't indoctrinated into them at an early age. In fact, all the research shows exactly the opposite, that children naturally speak, even in an atheistic family, they speak in terms of spiritual and divine ideas. And it's only when they're 7 or 8, and they go to school, they're taught that this is not how clever people talk. And in essence, it's beaten out of them, whereas Dawkins thinks it's beaten into them. So I just think that's an important point to make. But I did want to do that, and I thought what I'd do is go to Oxford, read theology and philosophy, and then go into a monastery. Various things happened that discouraged me from the latter course, but I was immediately put off. I was more or less told I shouldn't do theology and philosophy because, believe it or not, in 1971, when I was going up to be interviewed for a place, theology and philosophy wasn't an honors degree. And I believe it's literally true that somewhere in America you can get an honors degree in Frisbee, but then you couldn't get an honors degree in theology and philosophy. So instead, they said, well, you did well in your English exam. Why don't you come and do English? So I did.
Indeed. And the monastic thing was laid to one side?
It was laid to one side, but I think the calling, as it were, came back in a different form, which was to be a doctor. So there were various motivations, some of them intellectual. I needed to solve various philosophical problems that could only be done in an embodied way by being a doctor. But I think I had, yes, I'm not ashamed to say it, I think a vocation. Yeah. And this was the answer to the vocation.
No, terrific. I do have one. No, one last area, and then we'll have some questions. It's quite a lot of what you write. I wouldn't describe as bleak, but it's certainly, it pulls one up to think about the seriousness of the situation that we're in. And actually on your website you say, I believe that we are engaged in committing suicide, intellectual suicide, moral suicide, and physical suicide. If someone asked you, and they do, I know all the time, where do you see hope? How would you answer? And would the arts have anything to do with giving us hope, or do you see their future as ambivalent?
Well, I call myself a hopeful pessimist, which means that my assessment is that things are going badly. But I also know that it's only a fool who predicts the future. And many times in the past, one might have thought the world is ending, and it didn't. So I think there are grim times ahead, but I see a great deal of hope. And in some sense, to continue on the slightly negative side, but to show you that it turns things, I think things have to get bad before people are shocked out of their complacency, their comfortable, pointless existences, into seeing that actually we have a reason for being here, that human life has meaning, direction, and value, and that we need to recover these things. And I think we will recover them as things get worse. So in a sense, as things get worse, they get better. But in a more conventionally hopeful way, I see evidence all around me that particularly young people are starved of cultural, spiritual sustenance. They're taught a kind of nihilistic philosophy of scientific reductionism, which they believe has been proved. Of course, it can't be proved. It's a philosophical position that is assumed and flies in the face of much evidence, actually. However, there it is. But I think when I speak, a lot of grey heads like mine nod in approval and commend me. But a lot of young people are totally fascinated, and they come to me and say, this was electrifying. I've never heard anything like this. What do we do? And again, people feel overwhelmed. They think the problems are so enormous. The seas are polluted, the forests are being destroyed, whole ways of life are being put out of existence. What can little me do? And that's a very bad position to hold. Nothing good was ever achieved by people who took that position, but it also isn't reasonable. They sometimes say also, the world is so small and the universe is so large. What does it matter on this little rock? Well, first of all, Sir John Polkinghorne, who was both a theologian and a physicist, made the point that actually the universe needed to have been in existence for about the length of time that it has, and to be of about the size that it is, in order to support life at all. And this is corroborated by people like Lee Smolin, who's a physicist. So we can put out of our minds that idea, which comes from the left hemisphere, which is always interested in size rather than, in other words, quantity rather than quality. And what I say is, yes, we need to do certain practical things. Of course, we need to decarbonize and so forth. But none of this will add up to more than a hill of beans if it isn't accompanied by a change of heart and a change of mind. To see ourselves, see the natural world, and see the cosmos as different from the way we now see them, and see ourselves in relation to them once more. And this is life-giving. And it enables us to start from something very important, which is in here. You don't have to solve all the problems of the globe. That's not asked of you. The first place to start is with the thing you do have control over, which is what goes on in here. And if we changed our ways of thinking and talking so that it wasn't meaningless reductionism, but actually had some serious philosophy behind it and an attachment to things of beauty, goodness, and truth, that we could see a big change. And perhaps we would only need about 3 to 5% of the population to see this for it to carry a huge momentum in society. Because I think we're ripe for it. I think we're hungry for it.
So 3 to 5% of this group?
Well, I hope that 3 to 5% of this group will be interested enough in my ideas to pursue them and talk to other people about them. But remember to go, when they say, oh, all that stuff about hemispheres, it's all nonsense, it's all been debunked. You know, no, you haven't done your homework. You need to find out what the real differences are. So I just say that because many people write to me and say, I'm so fascinated by your ideas. My boyfriend is a scientist. I tried to interest him and he just dismissed the whole thing. But I think that's not an adequate response to a thesis that is grounded massively in science and philosophically fairly rigorously argued for.
Let's have some questions. I do plead with you to keep them short and for them to have a question mark at the end. All right? And preferably in one, possibly two sentences. That would be very good. And we have one there from Susan Eastman.
Okay. Yeah, hi, thank you so much. This is really wonderful. Back to the topic of attention that you began with, which is, I think, also wonderful and rich. And so you talk about this in terms of the hemispheres, but I also am interested in talking about it interpersonally. As you know, that in child development, attention begins between parent and child in the mutual gaze, and then there comes a point. It's called pointing, of it's called joint attention, where child and parent or whomever look together at a third object, and this is seen as a big developmental leap. And so I'm curious in your thoughts about how that changes and affects the quality of attention when it becomes a joint attention on a third object. And there are all kinds of philosophical and theological things one might think about in regard to that, but just your thoughts about that. Sorry.
Yes, well, the rapt attention of a mother and her infant is extraordinarily important to the growth of that infant. And I'm afraid somebody other than the mother doesn't cut the mustard as far as the baby is concerned. Dads become important in the second year of life, but they're not really important very much at that very early stage. And it is the right ventromedial frontal cortex of the mother in communion with the right ventromedial frontal cortex of the child that brings that child into a state of safe, secure knowledge of itself as still loved, although it dawns on the child, I'm actually separate from the mother. And to be able to pass that stage of differentiation from the initial primal union with the mother to one of being an individual requires the love and the security that comes from that gaze, from that attention. Joint attention, as you say, comes later and is peculiar to humans, apes, and dogs. Dogs understand joint attention. They see you're interested in something, they look at it. But if you point to something for a cat, it looks at your finger, but it doesn't understand what you're talking about. So, so that it is a very important thing. And what I love is that the word for observe in a scientific experiment in Japanese, I can't remember the word now off the top of my head, but it is the word that means to gaze at, in the sense that a lover gazes at the loved one. So it's not a clinical gaze, it is an attentive gaze, which is open to whatever that other may be.
In the front row here.
Thank you. I just had a question, just getting it back to the arts. You talk about in your writing how creativity is a foundational principle of the universe. In terms of the human interaction with that, I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about the sort of fundamental connectivity between artistic creativity and spirituality in terms of consciousness, and perhaps as a viewer of art, the difference between contemplating a piece of nature and an artwork.
Phew, well, that's a day's response, I think, but let me try and be very brief, because we haven't got a lot of time. I see that the general drive of the cosmos is nothing if it's not creative. It's a constant unfolding of something that was previously enfolded. So it is the evolution of something. It's like the opening of a bud. the bud contains a lot in potential. And as it opens, the flower is not destroyed, but actually comes into being through the articulation into separateness within the union, so that nothing is destroyed in the integration of something by its unfolding. I see that drive as being central to both the cosmos as a whole and to the business of life. And because we haven't got a lot of time to go into many things, I want to just put forward something that probably will be unfamiliar to most of you unless you've listened to me a lot, which is the idea that life is a response. So whatever the ground of being is, if I'm right that everything is fundamentally relational, that relations come before anything that can be related, because they stand out in a web of relationships, then that creative urge is creating something that it can have a relationship with. If it's love, then that's very obviously needs to be a free creation. And you may well ask, why should there be life at all? What's wrong with the inanimate universe? And nothing is wrong with it. But the animate universe has the capacity to respond 1 billion times more than a lump of rock to the divine essence of whatever it is. And so it can return and help to grow those values that I believe are aspects of the ontological primitive, whatever it is that grounds everything, the ground of being. So our purpose of being here is to be able to reflect and help grow, to the extent we can during our lives, things that are good, that are beautiful, and that are true. We can neglect that, fine. In my view, we've neglected the purpose of our life.
John.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It resonates so deeply, I'm afraid I'm going to burst into tears listening to you. I want to ask a question, and I hope it's not too off topic, but it might connect to your interest in monasticism. I want to get your thoughts on silence. Silence gets something of a bad rap, and I'm reminded of the cultural mantra that faced with the facts of oppression, silence is violence, and one could also consider more intimately the distant silence of the neglectful parent. However, silence as an intentional practice is highly treasured in ancient Christian contemplative spirituality, Zen Buddhism, Sufi mysticism, etc. Can you speak to if there is a relationship, the relationship between the practice of silence and the right hemisphere's way of attending to the world with a sense of openness?
Yes, I certainly can. Thank you very much for your question. I believe that the first take on anything comes via the right hemisphere. And Elkin Goldberg, who's a quite famous American neuroscientist, spent over a decade demonstrating that any new experience is first taken in the right hemisphere. It has the open awareness. The left hemisphere then picks it up and categorizes it, fragments it, analyzes it, and then that should be given back to the right hemisphere, so it now has an enriched, unfolded angle on whatever it was originally taking. Now that can be achieved best by the right hemisphere by stilling the voice of the left hemisphere. And one practice that does this is mindfulness. So in mindfulness, you espouse silence, but also inner silence, that you're chattering, the monkey mind that is talked about in Eastern traditions is stilled, and you're able, for the first time, just to be there and allow something to be present to you without judgment or articulation. That is very important. And I've discovered that silence is incredibly important for me. I can't do anything when I'm surrounded by conversation or any kind of stimulation. I spend most of my life in silence, and I love it. It's profoundly rich. It's impossible to describe. It's like a very nourishing thing, like water to me, silence. And I know that that's also true of many people who have entered holy orders in a monastery and so forth. So I think it is profoundly creative, and one of the desperate things about our lives is people are terrified of a silence. There's noise, background music, chatter everywhere. Nobody is at peace with the idea of silence, which is the bed of creativity.
Thank you.
You mentioned earlier your thoughts on STEM education, and I appreciated the way that you define or helped us redefine sort of thinking about the humanities necessary for human being. How would you, in terms of education, how would you reorder those priorities that we see today beyond just adding more arts or making more opportunities for the arts? How would you sort of reorder those educational priorities to combat what you're seeing with the emphasis on STEM education?
Okay, well, the way I was educated, which I think was very good, had at its core the idea of the humanities. And you could then, on the back of that, you could specialize further in languages, or you could specialize in science, or you could specialize in Latin and Greek. I ended up specializing in all of them because I'm like that. Can't make up my mind about anything. I'm a kind of, jack of all trades and master of none. So that's how it was. But the thing that couldn't be dispensed with at the core was you kept going through the humanities all the way up to school. And I think that's my model of a good education, because it is the humanities that eventually are the root of education. The other things are important around an education, but they can't stand on their own. And so that's the way I'd look at it.
Isan.
Thank you so much for being here. You talk a great deal about right brain and left brain and their duality, and of course we need them both in order to make sense of the world. I would imagine you don't advocate for only a right brain. I would imagine you advocate for both. I wonder if you can speak to what does that tell us, the complementarity of these two aspects of our existence, about the nature of reality and our role in it.
I didn't really hear it entirely clearly. What was the gist of the question?
What does the duality of left brain, right brain tell us about the nature of reality?
Oh, okay.
These two ways of attending. Is that right?
Yes. If that's right, that's a good question. And I remember being on a panel with Rowan Williams and saying whether the world looks the way it is because it's seen through a brain that has this structure, or whether the brain has this structure because it has to engage with a world that already has that structure, I can't say. And he said, in a devastating response that I should have said myself, does it have to be either? Because I believe they, in a way, are codependent. And so I believe that reality is a combination of both these drives, one of the left hemisphere to break up and to divide, and the gift of the right hemisphere, which is to see the whole picture and unify. And at a second level, I think the forces for division and union need to be unified, not divided. And there are a number of things that have that nature, as far as I'm concerned, that we need to be able to combine them. I sometimes say to see things properly and really it's not just to espouse the right hemisphere's view, because the right hemisphere view doesn't exclude the left hemispheres, it's to see them both.
Thank you. One more question. Yes, in the front.
Thank you so much.
Keep the left and right hemispheres, fairly balanced here. You understand?
So I'm worried about the self-fulfilling prophecy of what we imagine reality to be, and how we can. I'm wondering if when you said that only a small percentage of people need to begin to see things in the way that you see them for reality to start changing, if you could say more about how that happens, that our attention changes things.
Well, I suppose I should distinguish ultimate reality from a reality that we and our limited faculties can know. I mean, nobody can know the ultimate reality because we're limited by our faculties. But within the bounds of our faculties, which can see much, I believe, of what exists, at least in vestiges, if not fully, it's a matter of being faithful to what that reality is. So the word truth comes from the same root as trust, and in fact embodies the idea of being true to something, being true to your friend, being true to your people, being true to your faith, being true to yourself. These are not letting down. They are sort of being in accord with things that you powerfully believe are important. And I think that it's not a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. You must have the openness all the time to see what reality is like. For example, I didn't start my books with the conclusions that I arrived at. I came to some of those conclusions through the process of uncovering things. I'm perfectly open, and I think any thinker needs to be open to aspects of reality that disclose themselves to us. But as long as one is not substituting a preconception of one's own for what the evidence suggests. So in that sense, science is part of all our lives. It's a matter of being attentive to experience. Experience is ultimately the thing that is the test of truth.
Many here are training to be leaders in church and academy. You had one thing you'd like to say to them to close.
Oh gosh.
A message, a word of great wisdom. What would it be?
Well, I think it would be to find the right place for, whether you're a religious person or not, for faith. Faith doesn't mean certainty. If it was certainty, it wouldn't need faith. Faith is, as I say, a relationship to something in which you place some confidence. And in that sense, it's like a hand that's outstretched to you to help you ford a stream. It's not exactly certain, but it calls to you and helps to support you. And so not to think of faith as a matter of rules and facts, but of something very real, but needs to be nourished in a more, if you like, right hemispheric way than in the prescriptive way of the left hemisphere. Doctrines, rules, procedures, books have their place, but above all, it's living a life, and that is the best thing that you could do, is to show others and to model to others how to lead a life.
I'd like to thank Jeff Baker and the Trent Center and the Theology in Medicine and Culture people for giving us this opportunity. But of course, we need to thank you. You described yourself early on as a master of all trades, sorry, a jack of all trades, master of none. You could have fooled me, I think, on that. And gosh, you're the master, and we will be your emissaries. How about that? Dr. Iain McGilchrist, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.